Okay, welcome to Lecture 2 of Unit 3. Last lecture we covered the original economy, hunting and gathering, and now we're going to be getting into food-producing economies. So food-producing societies are very diverse, and they've been around for thousands of years. And they've developed political systems associated with them ranging from basically egalitarian to states and empires. So you'll be reading about some subsistence farmers in Nigeria that have a very simple political system and who use beer as a social leveling mechanism. But before we get into political systems and forms of social control, which is the subject of the next lecture, we need to understand what food-producing economies are and how they work. Okay, so you'll probably remember reading about the Neolithic Revolution in a world history class at some point in your life. This is an old term that anthropologists use to refer to the origins of food-producing economies. And literally what Neolithic means is new stone. So the Neolithic age or the Neolithic era is marked in the archaeological record by the appearance of new types of stone tools that are related to food production rather than hunting and gathering. So for example, manos and metates, which are used for grinding grain, are one common type of tool that appears when people start to practice food production. So the name Neolithic Revolution is a little bit misleading for a few reasons. First of all, people didn't just wake up one day and start being farmers or herders. The transition from hunting and gathering to food production was a long process, and sometimes it took thousands of years. The second reason why it's kind of a misleading term is that there wasn't just one Neolithic revolution, and after that everyone was producing food. The earliest agricultural societies developed in Mesopotamia and China around 10,000 years ago. And within the next couple of millennia, people also started farming in central Mexico and the central Andes. And as you can see from this map, agriculture arose independently in several regions over the course of the last 10,000 years. And as you know from last lecture, in some places, people did not stop hunting and gathering until very recently. So what this map is actually showing are the locations where various crops were domesticated. And I'm going to spend some time talking about what domestication is in just a minute. But before I get into domestication, I want to quickly return to Alman Service's classic model of cultural complexity. So as you can see here, various food-producing economies underpin political and economic hierarchies. So in a sense, the origins of food production were revolutionary since they led to the kind of highly complex and stratified society that we live in today. A special kind of relationship between humans and plants and animals lies at the heart of food-producing economies. So domesticated plants and animals form the basis of all of our contemporary economies. And these plants and animals have diverged from their wild ancestors through a process of coevolution, where human tending or cultivation slowly shapes their bodies and behaviors to suit our needs. And I like to start out talking about dogs because it's really easy for most people to relate to dogs since we see them a lot. You know, they're in our day-to-day environment more so than other domesticated plants and animals. And dogs were the first or the earliest domesticate, so they actually fitted right into hunting and gathering ways of life. And the first dogs may actually have evolved from wolves alongside humans as early as 33,000 years ago. And we know that humans brought domesticated dogs with them when they first arrived in North and South America, which was at least 15,000 years ago. So each of these guys, these dogs, some of my favorites, were bred to do something specific by people, which is why none of them really look that much like wolves. So wolves have evolved to live outside of human societies and take care of themselves, whereas dogs work for people. In exchange, we feed and protect them. So starting on the left with my dog, which is a lab mix, she's really good at swimming, she's obsessed with hunting, and she's very energetic and easy to train. And that's because she was bred by people to help hunt water birds. So the job of the lab was to swim out and retrieve the bird after they've been shot by the hunter. Okay, next up, we have my parents' pug, Ben, and he's a very ancient breed, so his ancestors came from China, where they were bred to entertain and comfort rich people. And one story about the domestication of pugs, or the breeding of pugs, I should say, which may not be completely true, but I like it anyway, is that they were originally bred to be slipped into big sleeves of rich people during the winter. So they were basically adorable living arm warmers. And you can see that Ben takes after his ancestors in that he still likes to snuggle up to something warm and lay around with humans all day long, but he's also up for being entertaining on occasion too. And the next dog, my cousin's basset hound, Ace, she was bred as a scent hound, so she was used for hunting rabbits, or her ancestors were. And her short little legs bring her super nose closer to the ground and make it easier for her to follow a rabbit into its den. And then the last dog there on the right, Pinkerton, is a Belgian Malinois. And these are some of the smartest animals around. So they were bred to be guards and shepherds. They're used to protect farms and other domesticated animals from predators and intruders. And they're so smart and serious about their work that they're now used by the police and by armies. And Pinkerton actually has been trained to participate in scientific research. So his job is to find the poop of a specific type of endangered ape in the mountain forests of China. And I'm going into all this detail about dogs so that you can see how much variation can arise from human selection. So from just one species, a wolf, we get all of these unique and wonderful helpers and companions. All right, so obviously hunters and gatherers domesticated dogs, and it's not very hard to imagine how that might have happened. Maybe they killed a female wolf and took her puppies, raising them to live with people. And over many generations, they either killed or abandoned the most aggressive puppies and kept the ones that were easy to train and useful. And these became dogs. So from a dog's perspective, this is a pretty good deal too, because they could eat the scraps and gnaw the bones of their human friends. They could sit by the fire. They were protected from cold and from other predators. And when they had puppies, instead of hiding and hoping that no one found their young, they could count on human protection. But hunters and gatherers also domesticated all of the earliest crops and types of livestock. So plants like wheat, barley, rice, corn, potatoes, and sunflowers, and animals like cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, and horses, just to name a few. All of these were primary domesticates, which means that they evolved directly out of hunting and gathering economies. So how did this happen? All right, well, you can remember from last lecture that we talked about this spectrum of hunting and gathering societies. And in the last lecture and in the documentary that you just watched, we mostly focused on egalitarian hunters and gatherers like the San, who move around a lot and don't invest much time in altering the environment to make it more productive. But now it's time to turn our attention to the other end of the spectrum, those hunters and gatherers with what we call delayed return strategies and low mobility. So these hunter-gatherers started to modify local environments, and when they did that, they changed the selective environment for plants and animals that live nearby, especially the ones that they relied on the most for food. To understand what happened, we need a theoretical framework that makes sense of human culture in evolutionary terms. And I like to use the concept of niche construction to understand this. So a niche is a concept from ecology, and it means the role that an organism plays in an ecosystem. So what it eats, where it sleeps, how it protects itself, etc. A niche construction is an organism-driven environmental modification. So when plants and animals change their environment through their own sort of activities and processes. And many, if not most, creatures do some kind of niche construction. So one of the most famous examples is the beaver, who creates entire ecosystems, the beaver pond, when they build their dams. And when a beaver builds a dam, it creates a whole host of new niches for everything from bacteria to carnivores. And beaver dams can shape local environments for centuries, even after a beaver has died. So even after that dam collapses and the pond drains, there's this unusually fertile and productive soil that's left behind. And these host different kinds of communities of plants and animals than they would if a beaver pond had never been there. And they also sometimes attract human farmers. But humans are the ultimate niche constructors. And there's many different examples of niches that humans create. So I've used a kind of extreme example here with Marie Antoinette and her pet pug, which is an animal that could never survive outside of the kinds of comfy human-created environments that we've created. But if we go back to hunters and gatherers, here's another example from the ethnography of the Paiute, who were indigenous people from California. And the Paiute were hunters and gatherers, and one of their most important foods was a particular species of wild grass. So they harvested the seeds of this grass and ate them, just like we eat the seeds of maize and wheat. And although this grass was wild, so they didn't, clear fields and plant seeds, it was naturally occurring. They did increase the size of these patches of wild grass, and they protected the grass from drought by irrigating the fields. So they diverted water from the streams out into these patches of wild grass that they ate. And over many years, practices like this can cause the plants and animals that live near humans, and they're important to them, to evolve differently from their wild relatives. So we call these processes human selection, as opposed to natural selection, which you'll remember from Unit 1 is Darwin's idea of the selective pressures that act on plants and animals in their natural habitat. So under human selection, we have basically two different kinds. We have automatic or unintentional and intentional forms of selection. So automatic things are things that humans are doing that might result in domestication without humans really intending for that to happen. So for example, humans might harvest grasses in such a way that they only capture some subset of the wild population. And over time, if they're only planting the seeds that they're able to harvest, then only those seeds have a chance to propagate in cultivated environments. And so that leads to evolution. Some cases they'll only create space for particular wild types around human settlements. So when we're talking about dogs, for example, you wouldn't allow an aggressive wolf puppy to stay in the human settlement. That puppy would have to leave or be killed. Whereas over time, you're selecting for wolves that are more and more friendly towards people, easier to train, and you end up with dogs. And then in some cases, human selection can occur just by moving plants and animals outside of their natural range, so they become isolated from their wild relatives. And that's happened lots of times. So a good example is maize, which is its wild ancestor comes from these tropical river valleys in central Mexico. And there's good evidence that when people took it out of these river valleys and up into the more arid highlands of central Mexico, that was when domestication really took off, because this grass was isolated from its wild ancestors, and so people could exert a stronger selective pressure on it. And then there are also intentional forms of human selection. So that includes the kind of mechanisms that we're very familiar with. So if you're a gardener, you might do this, right? You pick you're the best tomato or the best squash, to take those seeds and plant them again the next year, so that you're more likely to get a plant that has those same characteristics that you really like. And with animals, of course, that's selective breeding for particular characteristics. And people were probably doing this in ancient times. It does assume that they understood something about heritability, but I think they probably did. I mean, they probably recognized that their own children looked more similar to them than the children of other people. And that's really all you need to know to make the leap to selective breeding. Okay, so we talk about agroecosystems as a particular type of ecosystem that's constructed by people, and it's usually a little bit more simple. I said genetically simplified, but in terms of the amount of species that are present, an agroecosystem is usually a little bit more simple than a wild ecosystem would be, because it really only includes plants and animals that are valuable to people. And they're living in a sort of constructed environment that people have made for them so that they're more productive than they would be under normal circumstances. So here's a couple of examples of what can happen to plants under domestication. It's a little bit less familiar to us than the example of dogs and wolves. One of the most sort of freakishly domesticated plants in the world is corn, which I usually refer to as maize, just because that's a kind of more accurate botanical name for it. This plant, maize, comes from a wild grass called teosinte, which, as I just said, grows in Mexico. And you can see there on the left-hand side what teosinte looks like. That's the equivalent of a cob in domesticated corn. It's just a few kind of hard kernels that are stuck together, no cob, and very little edible material there. And it also kind of is a bushy plant. It has a lot of small seed heads rather than one big cob or two like modern corn has. So people have selected this plant over the course of 8,000 or 9,000 years to have bigger, juicier, sweeter kernels, a lot more kernels, and also to grow in a way that it's much easier to harvest, because all of those seeds are stuck together in a husk there, instead of being in a lot of different seed heads that are more difficult to harvest. Another cool example is the mustards, or all of these different vegetables that have been domesticated from the same wild weed, wild mustard, Brassica oleracea. So all these different vegetables that you see up here, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and cauliflower, are really all the same species. And the only reason that they look so different is because people in various parts of the world value different things about them. So in Asia, we ended up with kohlrabi, which was, bred so that it would have this really succulent stem that you can cut up and eat. In Europe, broccoli was developed, which has, these delicious flower buds that we eat primarily, and parts of the stem, etc. So depending on what people really valued in their own community, they bred this plant to look and taste different in various parts of the world. And here's an example of what domestication looks like in the archaeological record, or how we recognize it. This is one very famous site. This is from the Mexican state of Oaxaca. It's a site called Guilena-Quitz, and it's the site where we find the earliest sort of large macro remains of maize. And you can see that these maize cobs look really different from, what it would look like if you got an ear of sweet corn and ate all of the kernels off it today. They're much smaller. They had fewer kernels on them. The kernels were probably less sweet and harder to process, but still we can see that, 6,000 years ago, the process of domestication was really underway at this site in Guiana Keats. It looks very different from its wild ancestor already. And incidentally, at the same site, they also found the remains of early chili peppers. So you can see that, again, these are pretty small. Of course, there's small chili peppers today too. There's lots of different varieties. But these are sort of closer to their wild state or wild type chilies, but still ones that people have been cultivating for at least some amount of time and modifying from their wild state. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of a handle on domestication, I just want to give you a quick overview of the basic types of food production that humans have in the world. Okay, so we have agriculture, which is clearing land to plant crops, saving seeds, and cultivating the land. And there's a few different types of agriculture that we'll talk about. And then we have pastoralism, which is keeping herds of animals, controlling their reproduction, and moving them around to food and water. So this is a more mobile form of life. And then we have agropastoralism, which is kind of both, right? So you clear land for crops and you grow, some of your crops are fodder for your animals, and then you can provision the animals and you can also use their manure to fertilize the fields and you can use them to pull plows. So this is a kind of form of economy that we're all really familiar with sort of small scale, family farms in the US until about 50 years ago, and were mostly agro-pastoral farms. Okay. And then there's lots of other different types of food production systems that are really interesting, including managing forests, which is called arboriculture. People who primarily live off of rivers and coasts, but who do a lot to sort of increase those resources, which is called aquaculture, and many others. But we don't have time to get into all of the fascinating different types of food production systems that people use in this course. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, the origins of food production are really tied to the development of sedentism, urbanism, and complex stratified social systems. So sedentism means societies that don't move around, they stay put in one place. And of course, you need sedentism in order to develop urbanism, which is cities, right? And along with sedentism and urbanism come the kind of social systems that we're familiar with today, which are, ruled over by states or empires, with a lot of different social roles for different people. And the global distribution of wealth and power today partially reflects where and when food production first arose. Because food-producing societies had more people, they produced more food, they were able to have higher fertility rates because people didn't have to move around as much, and they developed these highly stratified social systems that allowed things like armies that could take over, other parts of the world. So food production really led to more power for the societies that first started to adopt it. And the example that I gave here is Egypt, which was one of the first food-producing economies, and as you all probably know, it was one of the major powers of the ancient world. Okay, so a sort of subset of agriculture is what we call horticulture. And another word for horticulture is gardening, although most people just associate gardening with sort of growing flowers or growing food for fun. There are people who actually make a living by growing very small and diverse plots, and usually they supplement their diet with either domesticated animals or hunting. But most people who make their living this way are just growing food for subsistence, not for surplus. But you can see that they often have very diverse and beautiful kinds of productive systems. Okay, so another form of agriculture is what we call extensive agriculture. And sometimes this is also referred to as shifting or slash and burn. I don't really like the word slash and burn because I feel like it's bad connotations. Like it seems like people are being very wasteful, slashing and burning all this vegetation in order to grow food. But actually, as it's practiced by traditional societies, it's a really interesting way of making a living because it requires a lot less input in labor and fertilizer than types of agriculture which are not extensive. So what people are doing in this system is they're moving around the landscape. So oftentimes their village will be in one place, but the location of their fields will shift over time. In order to clear a new field, they'll burn a patch of forest or prairie, and then all of the ash from the burnt vegetation will fertilize the soil. It'll be very productive for a few years. They'll grow crops there. And after it starts to lose that initial productivity, they'll let it go back to the wild, and they'll move their field to a different location. And after they let their fields go fallow, they can be really good habitats for hunting. For example, if you have a meadow that's been growing wild for a few years, oftentimes there'll be a lot of deer there, a lot of other types of animals that you can hunt. Or once it becomes a forest again, you can use that to forage for wild resources like nuts and medicinal plants. So it's a really interesting form of agriculture because instead of adding fertilizer to your soil, you're kind of using a natural progression to fertilize your soil by burning. Intensive agriculture includes high inputs of labor or fertilizer. So you have to invest more per area farm, but you can also get more out of a smaller amount of land. And it really requires domesticated animals or some other means of maintaining soil fertility. And I say that because there are other means of keeping your soil fertile even though you're growing it all the time. And one good example is rice paddies. So you can see here some rice paddies from Southeast Asia. These are fertilized because they contain water during part of the growth cycle. And so the algae that grows there, and sometimes even types of fish and other organisms, fertilizes that soil, and it keeps it going over many generations. And I added this caveat here because if you don't use plows, like many Native American forms of agriculture before European colonization, there were very few areas where people used plows, then you really don't lose your soil fertility nearly as quickly as you do if you use a plow. So in these forms of agriculture by hand, or just, hoeing up a small area by hand, you can keep cultivating plants in the same place for a really long time without having to move your fields around very much. Okay, so a system of intensive agriculture can sort of arise out of a system of extensive agriculture when population densities get bigger. So right here, you're seeing sort of schematic or cartoon version of an extensive agricultural system. So you have some fields, and then you have some fallows that have been not cultivated for various amounts of time, right? So some of them, maybe they've only been not cultivated for a couple years. There's sort of weedy annuals and grasses growing there, and you can go hunting in those areas. Other parts have maybe not been cultivated for a couple of decades, and they have some small trees you can use for firewood. You can forage for nuts there. And this is a very extensive system. The village is small, so they can afford to not use their land in a very intensive way because they don't require that much food. Okay, so the village is small. You can see these different types of fallows, grass fallow, bush fallow, tree fallow, etc. And this is showing the different types of resources that you might have there. So in your grass fallow, you might put your domesticated animals out there, let them graze. In your bush fallow, you might have some small animals like some, wild turkeys that you're hunting for. And in your tree fallow, you might find more forest animals that would be useful for you. Okay, so what happens if the village gets a little bit bigger? Well, they need to produce a little bit more food. So they close off more of their fallowed fields to produce crops. And at this point, maybe they don't have enough land left where they can have these long fallows where there's trees growing back. So they only have short fallows with pastures and bushes before they put them back into production. And as the village grows, they have less and less opportunity to leave land fallow, and they fill up more and more of the area around their village with crops. So eventually what we end up with is an intensive agricultural system where the soil fertility is maintained by spreading the manure of domesticated animals, and all of the land around the village is under constant cultivation. And at this point, we have an intensive agricultural system. And then from there, it can get even more intensive with multi-cropping strategies where you have 2 or more crops per year being grown in the same field. And most American farmers today do a system of multi-cropping. Of course, now we use sort of industrial methods which we'll be talking more about at the end of the semester. But American farmers usually will grow, something over the winter wheat or something like that, or some kind of cover crop to prevent erosion. And then they'll also have a summer crop of maize or soy. Okay, so moving on from agriculture, this is another form of food-producing economy that we're less familiar with in the United States because there aren't very many people who practice a pastoral way of life in the U.S. today. Pastoral people rely primarily on meat, milk, and blood of domesticated animals. And oftentimes they don't really eat meat very often. So mostly they're eating, milk and various products made from milk like yogurt and cheese and the blood of their domesticated herds. Sometimes they'll supplement this by hunting and gathering or by doing some kind of agriculture or horticulture that fits in with their their logistical mobility. Because they have herds of animals, they have to be moving around a lot. They have to make sure that the animals always have enough to eat. So they take the animals to places where they can eat and drink. And oftentimes, not everyone in the society will move around, but just a certain subset, usually young men, will take the animals out, move them around, and everybody else will stay put. Another kind of interesting form of food production is what's called aquaculture. And so this is kind of enhancement of aquatic plants and animals. And a good example comes from the traditional food-producing economies of Hawaii, where people built these things called fish ponds. But a better term might actually be algae pond, because the point of the pond was to produce more fish, or to provide a good habitat for fish. But what people were really doing was they were cultivating algae, and because there was more algae in the pond, it could support more fish, and then the people could get more out of it. They could get more fish than they would if they hadn't created this fish pond. So that's a form of aquaculture that's really cool and interesting. Okay, so all of these different food-producing economies require a lot of what's called traditional ecological knowledge. And these are communally maintained sets of knowledge about various kind of important strategies for monitoring, enhancing, and sustainably harvesting resources, as well as just general ecological knowledge about the local environment. But it's not just the knowledge, it's also the way that we teach members of society to the next generation to maintain these practices. And so there are a lot of institutions in traditional societies for passing on traditional ecological knowledge from one generation to the next. And these systems of traditional ecological knowledge are really powerful. They're what have allowed people to colonize every type of habitat, no matter how difficult that habitat might be. And unfortunately, in our industrialized society, we don't really have that much traditional ecological knowledge left. So most people pretty much live the same no matter what part of the United States they live in. Maybe you run your air conditioner a little bit more if you live in Tucson than if you live in Boston. But for the most part, you can follow the same sort of way of life no matter where you are. This is a very recent phenomenon. Until very recently, you would have to have had a very specialized set of knowledge to deal with the local environmental problems and potentials that you face. All right, so in the next lecture, we're going to talk about political systems, broadly speaking, and also social control.